keynote speaker, Dr. Günter Bechly from Austria, Vienna, has been waiting for quite longer time. So, Dr. Bechly, if you can hear me, you can start your first. Please let me know you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank
you. Can
you
you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. So, Dr. Bechly.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a scientist, he's a paleontologist. Also, he has a very important topic today for discussion, which is evidence against neo-Darwinism and evidence for intelligent design. So thank you so much for joining us. And so you can start your presentation now.
So, thank you. So maybe to little introduce myself. So I'm a German paleontologist. I worked for 16 years for a natural history museum in Germany, then organized the largest event for the celebration of the Darwin year in 2009, and thereby came into contact with arguments for intelligent design and gradually explored these arguments, became convinced myself, and ultimately now I'm working for the Discovery Institute in Seattle, which is a think tank which is spearheading the intelligent design movement. So this is a little background on myself. So I will start screen sharing so that you can see some slides that I prepared. So I hope you can see the first slide. Maybe somebody can give me a sign if everything's working. Okay, so my talk, Scientific Evidence Against Neo-Darwinism and Intelligent Design. So this title already says that I will not talk about religion. I will not talk about scriptures or creationism. Actually, personally, I couldn't care less if there is a conflict between scripture and science. I don't think that religion should influence our scientific conclusions. I will also not talk about age of the earth or common ancestry. This is not the issue of intelligent design. The issue is an unguided process of natural selection acting on random mutation. Is this a sufficient, adequate explanation for the history of life, or is some other explanation like an input of information from outside of the system or intelligent design required? So I will introduce purely scientific arguments that give us reason to doubt that neo-Darwinism is sufficient as explanation and that there is a better explanation in intelligent design. So many critics of intelligent design, when they say, well, but there's so much evidence for evolution and there's no debate in mainstream science, they often confuse evidence for common ancestry with evidence for the neo-Darwinian process. I totally grant that there is a lot of evidence for common descent. I personally have no problem to be descended from a lobefin fish or protist even. This is not the issue. The issue, as I said, is the mechanism. Is an unguided mechanism sufficient as explanation? The issue is not common ancestry. So what kind of arguments give us reason to doubt that neo-Darwinism is sufficient? Now, the first argument concerns the very origin of life. So biologists, mainstream biologists will say, well, but origin of life, that has nothing to do with neo-Darwinian evolution. That's true. The origin of life is something different. But the problem is the following. Darwinian evolution is based on descent and on inheritance of genetic material, of variation, and so on. So this process presupposes a replicator, some biological unit that can self-replicate and that has a genetic code to make inheritance. So evolution needs this to get going, but it cannot itself explain the origin of the system because it requires this system for this mechanism of random mutation and natural selection to work in the first place. So you have a chicken and an egg problem. And the problem is that the Darwinian process of random mutation, natural selection, is the only idea humankind ever came up with how to explain the origin of complexity from simple beginnings with a mechanistic bottom-up process. If this process cannot explain the complexity of the first replicator, and it turned out that this first replicator had to be pretty complex, then we have to invoke another explanation to explain this. And there is no naturalistic explanation around how to explain the origin of this first replicator, this whole origin of life. Origin of life research of the past decade, it basically failed. There is no real progress to really explain how did we get living cell, first living cell from non-living, nothing but speculations. I will not go into the details, but you can go online and watch some lectures by biochemist James Tour on this very issue. And even mainstream biologists have recognized this. There's, for example, Eugene Koonin, famous evolutionary biologist, who is meanwhile invoking an infinite multiverse of parallel universes to explain the origin of life. And if we have to accept such explanations for the origin of life, then the question is, why not invoking such explanations later for the rest of the history of life, if we need something else than neo-Darwinism to explain complexity? So, but there's more. There is direct evidence that this also applies to the history of life itself after life originated. So all life is built by proteins. Proteins are the building blocks of all life, and proteins themselves are built by amino acids. The amino acids are kind of letters in an alphabet, and the proteins are words or sentences. And there are about as many amino acids as there are letters in the English alphabet, something more than 20. And the proteins have lengths of 200 to some thousand amino acids. Now you have a vast mathematical combinatorial space of possible combination of amino acids to build proteins. And the question is, how often do you find in this mathematical search space islands of function? Because proteins have to fold in a certain three-dimensional way to make any biological, allow for any biological function beyond being sticky, say. So how often do you find these islands of function in this vast combinatorial search space? And this has been studied by my colleague Douglas X, has been published in mainstream peer-reviewed literature. And it turned out that it's only 1 in 10 to the power to 77 sequences, possible sequences of a certain length, that you get these islands of function. This means you cannot get from one island of function to another island of function by just a few steps that are reasonably likely by random mutations. You need a lot of changes that have to be coordinated to get from one island of function to the next. And this is not possible with a Darwinian process, which is based on accumulation of many small changes, and each of the changes has to be either neutral or convey an advantage. This is not possible in this case because these islands of function are separated by a gulf of non-functional, dysfunctional sequences. So you cannot get proteins by a new protein folds by a Darwinian process. The next argument concerns the issue of irreducible complexity. And this is nothing intelligent design proponents have invented. Actually, it's based on an argument by Charles Darwin himself. And he said in his famous book on the origin of species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So he gave a possibility to falsify his theory, and intelligent design proponents do nothing less than just take up this idea and look, are there such cases where complex organs cannot have been built by multiple successive modifications? And this issue that you need many little steps is not just from Darwin's time, it's still valid today. The most famous popularizer of Darwinism is Richard Dawkins, and he wrote a book called Climbing Mount Improbable. And there he also acknowledged that Darwinism can only work and has only any explanatory value if it can allow to explain big changes with an accumulation of many small steps. Sorry. So what kind of structures could fulfill this criterion of falsification? Now, if you look in the cell, Darwin believed the cell is basically, could you please stop the remote control of my screen? That's not good. I have to start the screen sharing again. Something happened. Okay, try this again.
Did your presentation ended, or we should look?
No. Somebody required a remote control of my screen, and I allowed, and this was
you shouldn't
no good
allow
idea.
There are hackers who are looking for the link of this conference, so you should not allow it. Maybe we.
Oh, okay. That was too late already. So we will try this again, and
okay.
The screen doesn't appear on.
Please let me talk to my technical team. Please fix the issue. I think you should. There is no issue from your side. Dr. Bechly, the issue is from your side. Maybe you can.
Yeah. I will try. We will get this sorted out in a moment. So, do you see the screen again? So, do you see the screen again?
Yes, we can see it now. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. So Darwin still thought that cells are just blobs of jello. But now we know that cells are highly complex. They include molecular machines, and I just give a few examples. One is the bacterial flagellum. The bacterial flagellum is a kind of outboard motor for bacteria. It's built by 40 different proteins, and it doesn't only look like an electric motor, it is an electric motor. You see here a little animation, which hopefully works on your shared screen as well. And you see it's rotating. It's a real electric motor driving the locomotion of a bacteria. It's built of 40 proteins. And if you take away these proteins, you don't get 39 proteins, 38 proteins, and everything makes sense. And you have a functioning apparatus. Actually, you have something with 20 proteins that can work. You have something with 40 proteins that can work, and in between there is nothing. So you cannot get with small steps from one function to the next in building up these molecular machines. So they cannot be built in this Darwinian process. This fulfills this criterion that Darwin gave us to falsify his theory. The same for the mechanism that is used to replicate DNA, the so-called helicase. You see, it's a kind of double-stranded copying machine. And also, this is built by so many proteins. If you take one away, the whole function breaks down. So it doesn't work. And final example here, the kinesin motor protein. It's a kind of walking transport robot that is walking along these kind of fibers in the cell. So all these molecular machines cannot be built by a stepwise process. Another argument concerns complex specified information. So complex specified information is nothing else like semantic information, where, like in a computer code, where you have a code of signs that convey a message that is referring to outside of itself. It has a meaning. This is also true for DNA, where the code, this kind of digital code of 4 letters of the DNA codes for proteins. So what has been shown mathematically is if you take the probabilistic resources of our universe, whole size of the universe, whole lifespan of the universe, all kind of quantum events that were possible, you can show that not more than 500 bits should be able to be produced naturally. This is an empirical prediction by intelligent design theory. You just have to write a computer program that can create more than 500 bits of new specified information without putting in this information or smuggling it in from the outside. And this prediction would be refuted. This is also showing that intelligent design is testable like any other science. But any software engineer knows that software programs, they cannot be improved by random accidental changes. If you take Windows XP or Windows 10, and you introduce random changes into the code will break down before it gets any new function, and you will not be able by this mechanism to get from Windows to Mac OS or something like this. So information science shows, and this is a quote here from a secular information scientist, actually the pioneer of information theory in biology, Henry Quastler, who said information habitually arises from conscious activity. And the next argument on which I'm currently working myself is the so-called waiting time problem. And it's based on the following issue. You take two fields that are usually considered as good support for Darwinian evolution. One is the fossil record that apparently establishes macroevolution, intermediate fossils and long periods of time and so on. And on the other hand, the mathematical apparatus of population genetic, which shows, for example, how drug resistant can originate and spread in a population of germs in a petri dish. And the argument from Darwinists is, well, you just have to extrapolate. You take this microevolution, which we can observe in the lab by population genetics, and extrapolate this over millions of years, and boom, then you have the explanation for macroevolution. But actually, if you really combine these two disciplines, you find a fatal problem for Darwinism. So, for example, look at the origin of whales, where we have a nice series of fossils, by the way, mainly from Pakistan and India, which show these kind of transitional series. And we have very good datings for these fossils. What we can show is that the time that is available to make a transition from something that basically looked like a pig, like Pachycetus, a land-living animal, to the first really fully marine whale with a fluke like Basilosaurus is only 4.5 million years. 4.5 million years sounds a lot, but it's just the lifespan of a single larger vertebrate species. And if you use the mathematical apparatus of population genetics and you calculate, would the mutations, the genetic changes that are required to make this transition from a pig-like ancestor to a fully dolphin-like, whale-like animal, would these mutations be possible in this window of time? Because they not only have to originate in a population, but they also have to spread in the population. And the calculations show that it's orders of magnitude off. So the available time span of 4.5 million years, you would at least need 10 times the time to let population genetics explain how this could come about. And also from my own discipline are the discontinuities in the fossil record. So discontinuities are, for example, these abrupt origins that new groups come into being suddenly on a biological and geological scale, suddenly these so-called explosions in the fossil record, that you have this kind of top-down pattern where first you get big differences and then the smaller variations, not the other way around. The ghost lineages where the fossils don't document the existence of the groups and you have to just postulate them without evidence. This phenomenon of stasis and of living fossils that don't change over hundreds of millions of years, even though this molecular clock of mutation is ticking, even though all the habitats are changing. So you cannot say, oh, it's stabilizing selection, the habitats stay the same. No, everything changed and these animals still stay the same. And even on the species level, you don't find evidence for gradual species to species transition. Everywhere in the fossil record, you find discontinuities. This was known to Darwin. He said geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection, and so on and so on. So he appealed to the imperfection of the geological record and said, well, probably it's an artifact of our lack of knowledge of the fossil record and of the incompleteness of the fossil record. This whole issue has been, is also issue of a book by my colleague Steve Meyer called Darwin's Doubt. And this Darwin's Doubt is still with us. One of the most renowned paleontologists and evolutionary biologists of the 20th century was George Gaylord Simpson. And he said, it is, and this is 100 years after Darwin, it is a feature of the known fossil record that most taxa appear abruptly. They are not, as a rule, led up to by a sequence of almost imperceptibly changing forerunners, such as Darwin believed should be usual in evolution. This poses one of the most important theoretical problems, and so on. So, and also, as I said, Richard Dawkins made similar statement in 2009. He said, evolution not only is a gradual process, as a matter of fact, it has to be gradual if it is to do any explanatory work. And it's not for nothing that Charles Darwin, in his own magnum opus, Origin of Species, said 6 times a Latin sentence called natura non facit saltus, nature doesn't make jump. Because he knew if it would allow for saltations, for jumps, this couldn't be a naturalistic bottom-up explanation with small changes accumulating over long periods of time. This requires something like miracle-like events. So there has to be gradualism, and if gradualism is refuted by the empirical evidence, then the theory is in problems. And of course, people, as Darwin said, also today, many will say, well, that's just gaps of evidence. And paleontologist Philip Gingerich said gaps of evidence are gaps of evidence and not evidence of gaps. This is really true. Actually, we can check this. There's a simple test, and an analogy how this test works is, imagine you have a new hobby, you do beach combing, you walk along the shore and you collect what the flood washes in, shells and starfish. Every day you find something new, you find new mussels, new snails, and so on. But after a while, repetition sets in and you find only the stuff that you have found before. And then you know that you have sampled enough to know that any remaining gaps are real gaps and not gaps because you were too lazy to collect more. So this same procedure is used in paleontology. It's called the collector curve, and there you plot just the effort you have to invest to find new fossil groups, and on the other axis, the new discovered fossil groups. And then you have this curve where you can see at the beginning it's steep. You don't have to invest a lot of energy, time, grant money. You can measure this however you want. And you find easily new stuff, but then this curve flattens and then repetition sets in. And then you know that you have sampled enough that the remaining gaps are real. And this has been tested in most groups of fossil organisms. And we know that these gaps that we still have and that have rather become bigger than smaller than in Darwin's times are real data where nature tells us something. So a most famous example for these explosive abrupt origins is, of course, the Cambrian explosions about 520 million years ago. All these different groups of animal body plans came into being, the so-called phyla like arthropods and mollusks and echinoderms and chordates. They came into being suddenly without any precursors in the preceding layers. And of course, people thought maybe it's just that there are no suitable layers. Meanwhile, we have found exactly the same layers that are older than the Cambrian, and there is nothing like potential ancestors of these Cambrian phyla. And one of the world's famous specialists on the Cambrian animals, Derek Briggs, he wrote in 2015, we now know that the sudden appearance of fossils in the Cambrian is real and not an artifact of an imperfect fossil record. So Darwin's cop-out doesn't work any longer. And what this Cambrian explosion shows is this top-down pattern rather than bottom-up pattern. We would expect that we first find an ancestral species and then small differences, and over millions of years they become different genera and then different families, and after tens of millions of years maybe different families, and after hundreds of millions of years maybe different phyla. But what we actually find is the opposite. We find sudden appearance of 20 different phyla and then the variation on these phyla themes afterwards. So the opposite of the prediction from the theory. Usually in science, when empirical evidence conflicts so much with your theory, you rethink the theory and not try to shoehorn the evidence to let your theory survive. So these explosions, the Cambrian explosion is not an exception from the rule. You find this in all periods of Earth history, in all geographical regions, in all groups of organisms, from protists to plants to invertebrates. You find it with the origin of life, which appeared suddenly at the very first moment. in Earth history where life was possible, with the origin of photosynthesis right at the beginning of life, with the Avalon explosion, this origin of the strange Ediacaran biota, with the Cambrian explosion, and then the great Ordovician biodiversification event, the Siluro-Devonian terrestrial revolution, where land plants came suddenly into being. And this has been called an analog of the Cambrian explosion for plants. The Devonian Necton revolution, where all the marine ecosystems were turned upside down, the odontode explosion. All these names, revolutions, explosions, are not made up by intelligent design proponents. These are the mainstream names for these events coined by mainstream evolutionary biologists. The explosive origin of flying insects and the Carboniferous, even with this complete metamorphosis. Several Triassic radiations of tetrapods, the sudden appearance of dinosaurs, of 15 families of marine reptiles from zero within a few million years. The origin of flowering plants that has been called by Darwin himself an abominable mystery, and this mystery has become bigger with our growing evidence of the fossil record, not smaller, which also shows that this is not an artifact of our lack of knowledge, that the problem gets bigger with no more orders of magnitude more knowledge than Darwin had. The so-called Big Bang of birds, the placental mammal explosion, and there's even something that has been called the Big Bang theory of human evolution, because there's a large gap between the ape-like Australopithecine of Eastern Africa and the first representatives of our own genus Homo, and this gap has been to make the transition has been called the Big Bang theory of human evolution. So you find this pattern everywhere, and it's the opposite of what is predicted from Darwin. And the same is not true just for macroevolution, but even for the species-to-species level. There has been a publication in the Darwin Year by Hunt, 2010, and he explored the fossil evidence for species-level transformations in the light of 150 years of paleontological research since Darwin. And he reviewed all the literature. And what he concluded is that the meandering and fluctuating trajectories, so no gradual trajectories from A to B, captured in the fossil record are not inconsistent with the centrality of natural selection as an evolutionary mechanism. Of course, he has to make a formal nod to the evolutionary theory, but then he says, but they probably would not have been predicted without the benefit of an empirical fossil record. Now, if you translate this doublespeak into what this really means, is that the empirical evidence does not fit with the predictions of the theory. The theory predicts this kind of linear trajectory from A to B and not meandering, fluctuating, chaotic patterns. We find no evidence. There's not a single surviving example for gradual species-to-species transition in the whole fossil record. So mainstream evolutionists actually admit this problem. I've attended a conference in 2016 at the Royal Society in London. It was called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, and the keynote speaker was a famous Austrian evolutionary biologist called Professor Gerd Müller. And in his keynote speech, he showed this interesting slide. It's titled Explanatory Deficits of the MS Theory. MS stands for modern synthesis, which is just a synonym for neo-Darwinism. And explanatory deficits means what the theory cannot explain. And among what neo-Darwinism cannot explain, he lists phenotypic complexity, so complex new structures, phenotypic novelty, the origin of novel biological novelty in the history of life, and non-gradual forms of transition, what I explained before.
Dr. Bechly, I'm afraid we're running short of time. Please.
Okay, I'm finished in a second. So if the theory cannot explain this, then the theory fails to be a good explanation for neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism has been actually declared dead. Even atheists agree. Like Thomas Nagel, who wrote a book, Why Neo-Darwinism is Almost Certainly False. And you can make a good case, not by an argument from ignorance, not a God of the gaps argument, but an argument from inference to the best explanation. If neo-Darwinism cannot explain this and we have no alternative explanation, all the suggested alternatives of the so-called extended synthesis failed, then what can explain this? And we know the only cause that can explain sudden origins of new complex information, and that is the activity of an intelligent conscious agent. And therefore, intelligent design is the better explanation for the history of life. Thank you.